My story begins on the afternoon of my 40th birthday, though it certainly wasn't the joyful milestone I'd once dreamed it would be. Instead of being swept off my feet with some grand celebration or surprise, I was standing in the grocery store, ticking items off my list, rushing to make dinner for myself. In my younger years, I'd pictured something different for this big birthday. A getaway to some dreamy beach with a glass of champagne, or maybe a surprise party thrown by my husband, surrounded by friends. But this was just another Tuesday, a regular day with a little birthday dinner I decided to throw together myself. Karen and Eric, my two closest friends, would be there, thankfully. They had been the constants, friends who had stayed through thick and thin, even when life got in the way. But Vincent, my husband? I hadn't seen him all day, and not a single call or text had come from him. He told me earlier that he was swamped at work, as usual. It stung, honestly, and it wasn't just the no-show today. This had become our life, our routine. The same Vincent who used to surprise me with flowers or spontaneous date nights had become a man who barely noticed when I entered the room. Work always seemed to come first, and it felt like I'd long since faded into the background of his life. With each item I tossed into my cart, memories and questions tangled up in my mind. Was it me? Did I stop being interesting or become some kind of burden to him? I tried to be understanding, supportive, the patient wife. But patience was wearing thin, and loneliness was starting to fill the spaces where love used to live. I shook the thoughts away as I reached the checkout and headed out of the store. My mind was so clouded I hardly noticed I'd stepped off the curb without looking. Suddenly, a jolt. A car coming out of nowhere, just barely grazing me. I lost my balance. My bag slipped from my hands, and I stumbled, landing hard on the pavement. My groceries scattered everywhere. Apples rolling under nearby cars, a carton of eggs cracked open, and lettuce leaves sprawled out like a sad salad right there in the parking lot. Before I could even gather my thoughts, a man jumped out of the car, practically running over to me. He looked genuinely horrified, his face creased with worry. "Oh my gosh, are you okay?" he asked, reaching out his hand. "I'm so sorry. I just didn't see you there." I tried to keep my face calm, to brush off the embarrassment and hide the sting of the bruises I'd probably have later. "It's fine, really," I said quickly, avoiding eye contact as I started gathering what was left of my groceries. My hand throbbed a little, and my pride was definitely worse off, but I wanted to just get home and forget the whole thing. But the man, Michael, he introduced himself, wasn't having it. "At least let me help you pick up these things," he said, his voice calm and insistent. As he loaded my broken groceries into his trunk, he insisted on giving me a ride. And I don't know why, but something in his tone, or maybe the way he smiled, made me feel safe. Normally, I would have declined, but for once, I just nodded. As we drove, he kept things light, telling me about his day and cracking small jokes that actually made me laugh. Real laughter, something I hadn't done in a while. There was an ease about him, and I could feel my shoulders relaxing as we chatted. He had a natural kindness to him, an openness. And he was funny, a lightness in his voice that was contagious. At one point, he looked over at me, and with a small smile, he said, "You know, your husband's a lucky guy." The comment caught me off guard, and I felt my cheeks warm. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at me that way, let alone said anything so kind. When we arrived, I thanked him, and he lingered for a second, looking like he wanted to say something more, but then just nodded and left. I stepped inside, hoping, for a flickering moment, that maybe Vincent would be home. I opened the door to silence, a darkness that felt heavier than usual, and I was alone again. I stood there for a moment, the emptiness of the house surrounding me, and all I could think about was the ease I'd felt talking to Michael, a complete stranger. With Vincent, it had been years since I felt anything close to that. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness, realizing how stark the contrast was. Karen and Eric arrived shortly after I finished setting the table. They each hugged me warmly, wished me a happy birthday, and handed me a gift, something small and wrapped in bright paper, which Karen had clearly picked out. I smiled, trying to stay present, to really enjoy their company. They'd come for me, after all, to celebrate me. And yet, even with them there, my mind kept wandering, my eyes straying to the front door. I was hoping, no, I was waiting, for Vincent to come bursting in, surprising me with flowers, maybe a bottle of my favorite wine, or just something that showed he remembered, that he cared. But as the minutes passed, that hope wore thinner, and I felt it start to sting. Karen tried to pull me into conversation, recounting a story from her day at work, but I found myself nodding absently, my gaze drifting to the door again and again. "Clara," Karen said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "He'll be here soon." She didn't say it as a question. It was like a soft reassurance, as though she knew that despite everything, I still clung to some thread of belief. And then, finally, I heard the familiar sound of the door clicking open. For a second, my heart lifted. Maybe he'd realized he was late. Maybe he was going to apologize, hug me, and make me feel like I was his priority again. But when he walked in, my heart sank. Vincent was empty-handed, no flowers, no bottle of wine. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he tossed his keys onto the console table, murmuring, "Sorry, had to finish a call," and made a beeline for his office, mumbling something about a meeting. A meeting on my birthday. He didn't notice the table I'd set, or the way Karen and Eric looked at him. He barely even noticed me. He just walked right past us, slipping into his office and shutting the door. The air felt thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of my friend's eyes on me. Karen's face held that gentle, empathetic expression she used when she was trying to decide whether to say something or let things go. Eric, normally talkative and relaxed, looked visibly uncomfortable. They exchanged a glance, but said nothing. What was there to say? Karen gave me a sympathetic smile, patting my arm as if to say, "We see you, Clara. We're here." And I could see in her eyes that she was hurting for me, maybe more than I was willing to admit I was hurting for myself. I didn't want them to feel sorry for me. And yet, I felt something break inside. Here were my best friends, bearing witness to the emptiness that had crept into my life, into my marriage. I tried to keep my chin up, keep the evening light, but my mind was racing with what Vincent's absence really meant. It was more than a missing birthday card or a forgotten present. It was like the very idea of me had somehow slipped from his life, as if I were just one of the many things he could ignore on his way to something he deemed more important. That night, lying in bed alone, the quiet of the house pressed in on me like a heavy weight. I stared at the ceiling, my mind running in circles, replaying every little moment of the evening, every careless word Vincent had tossed my way, or didn't bother tossing at all. I tried so hard to ignore it, to stuff down the anger and the hurt for so long. But on this night, something finally snapped, and I let myself feel it, every ounce of pain and frustration that had built up over years of feeling invisible in my own marriage. My throat tightened, and tears pooled in my eyes. This wasn't what life was supposed to be, was it? When I'd walked down that aisle, I'd imagined a future built on love and partnership, a life where we celebrated each other's joys and shouldered each other's burdens. But here I was, lying alone on a night that should have felt special, feeling like a stranger in my own home, in my own marriage. I'd given everything to us, to him, and somewhere along the line, I'd lost myself in the process. The next morning, after a night of fitful sleep and endless thoughts, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I found Vincent in the kitchen, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone like it was just another normal day. But for me, it was anything but. "Vincent," I began, my voice sharper than usual, "we need to talk." He barely looked up, and I felt my frustration swell. "We've been growing apart, and I need you to acknowledge it. I need you to acknowledge me." He finally glanced at me, but there was no empathy, no regret in his eyes. Just the calm indifference I'd grown used to, though I hated it now more than ever. "Look," he said, with a sigh that felt more like an inconvenience than anything else. "I'm seeing someone else." The words felt like they landed in slow motion, and I stared at him, waiting for some sign that he was joking, that this was a horrible, twisted misunderstanding. But he kept going, almost matter-of-factly. "She's pregnant." My world came crashing down with those words. They felt like knives, slicing through every hope I'd held onto, every moment I'd tried to make things better between us. I felt my knees weaken, my breath coming shallow. Pregnant? My mind scrambled, trying to piece together what this meant, trying to understand the extent of the betrayal that had just come to light. This was the man I had built a life with, the man I'd sacrificed so much for. I'd stood by him through every difficult project, every promotion, pushing my own dreams aside to support his. I'd poured every bit of myself into our marriage, believing that we were in this together. But now, he was leaving me. And he hadn't just betrayed me. He had a new life, a new child on the way. Some part of me wanted to scream, to throw things, to lash out and let him feel even a fraction of the devastation he'd caused. But instead, I stood there, frozen, swallowing down the bitterness, tasting the words I'd never get the chance to say. He was leaving, and he hadn't even looked back. I could feel the life we'd built crumbling around me. The foundation that I'd once thought was unshakable now nothing but dust and echoes. He didn't stay to explain. He didn't even apologize. And as he walked out, leaving me standing there, I realized something. The only way to move forward would be to leave him behind. In the days that followed, I moved in with Karen and Eric. Their guest room became my new sanctuary, a place where I could fall apart without judgment. I barely spoke. I hardly ate. Everything felt muted, like I was watching my life through thick glass, separated from reality, while the heartbreak pulsed like a dull ache in the background. Karen was a constant, staying up with me, talking if I felt like talking, sitting with me in silence if I didn't. She'd always been the outspoken one, fierce and protective. I could tell she wanted to do something, anything, to make me feel better. There was this fiery glint in her eyes when she talked about Vincent. She wanted me to get angry, to confront him, to show him exactly how deeply he'd hurt me. She wanted him to pay for it, to feel the weight of his betrayal. But I couldn't summon the energy. There was this numbness that had settled over me, like a blanket keeping me safe from the rawness of my own feelings. I felt broken, too broken to be angry. I knew that fighting for him, trying to make him understand what he'd done, would get me nowhere. He'd already made his choice, and dragging myself through that would only deepen my pain. I could see Karen struggling with my decision. "Are you sure you don't want to make him feel this?" she would ask, as if any amount of vengeance could somehow patch the wound he'd left. But deep down, I knew that this was a battle I'd already lost. Staying and trying to hold on to him would only shred what little dignity I had left. So, I made the hardest decision of my life. I went down to the courthouse, filed for divorce, and set about the difficult task of untangling myself from the life I'd known for so long. I was stepping into a void of uncertainty, but a small voice inside me reminded me that this was the only way forward, no matter how terrifying it felt. The image of my life stretched out before me like a blank page. I could go anywhere, do anything, but I also had no idea where to start. With Karen's help, I began searching for apartments. It was a strange feeling, walking through spaces with empty walls and bare floors, wondering if this was where my life would restart. Each place I toured felt foreign, cold, like a reminder of how alone I was. I kept picturing what it would be like to come home to a place where there were no memories of us, of him. I'd walk through these rooms, imagining what it would be like to cook in that kitchen by myself, or wake up to sunlight streaming through those windows, the silence punctuated only by my own breathing. I was terrified of living alone for the first time in years, of having no one to fall back on. But somewhere within that terror, I also felt a quiet determination growing, a sense that maybe I could rebuild something out of this rubble. That maybe, just maybe, I could find myself again amidst the wreckage he'd left behind. Eric offered to help me pack up my things, to go back into that house that no longer felt like my own. I knew that walking through those rooms, picking up the fragments of my old life, would be brutal, but I had to do it. I had to claim what was mine, separate from him, from the memories. So I steeled myself and took one last look in the mirror, the face staring back at me, one I hardly recognized, yet one I was determined to rebuild. With each step toward that new apartment, I felt the weight of the past slowly starting to lift, even as the uncertainty loomed larger. I was alone, but for the first time, I was beginning to think that might be exactly what I needed. Settling into my new apartment was both freeing and surreal. It was a tiny one-bedroom on the second floor of an older building, just a few blocks from Karen and Eric's place. The walls were plain, the floors creaked in places, and the view wasn't much to speak of, just rooftops and distant buildings. But it was mine. There were no echoes of Vincent here, no memories I had to dodge. It was just me. I bought second-hand furniture, filled the shelves with books, and, slowly, I started to feel at home. I would sit by the small window, cup of tea in hand, watching the world go by, knowing I had taken my first steps toward something new. But those steps also left me feeling slightly adrift. I needed a purpose, something to fill the days and remind me that I was capable, that I had something to give. That's when Eric, bless his heart, offered me a job at his architecture firm. I'd always had a love for design, even studied it in college before shifting to support Vincent's career. So when Eric asked, I was both surprised and grateful. It wasn't my dream job by any stretch, but it was something real. It was a chance to focus on more than just getting through the day. It was a chance to build something, to learn, and to work alongside people who respected me. The hours were long, but I found I liked that. Each project brought a new challenge, and as I threw myself into my work, I felt the wounds Vincent had left beginning to heal. And then, in a twist I hadn't seen coming, I ran into Michael. I was carrying a stack of files to one of the meeting rooms when he walked in. I froze for a moment, recognizing him immediately, and he paused, then broke into that same warm smile I remembered. He didn't bring up our first encounter, and neither did I. He just nodded, his eyes crinkling slightly, as though we were sharing an unspoken memory. As it turned out, Michael was a new client working with our firm on a house he was planning to build by the river. It was a beautiful property, with tall trees framing the landscape and a view that overlooked the water, tranquil and endless. We were to help design the house, and as one of the newest members of the team, I was assigned to work with him on the project details. From our very first meeting, I felt at ease around him. There was an openness about Michael, a way he had of listening when I spoke, as if what I said genuinely mattered. He was attentive, considerate, and the more we talked, the more I began to look forward to our meetings. He would come in with ideas and sketches, and we'd sit for hours discussing every detail, from the layout to the materials to the placement of windows, so he could get the best view of the river at sunset. I hadn't laughed this easily in so long, and each smile felt like a small step back toward the person I used to be. One afternoon, after a meeting, Michael casually mentioned he had a daughter, Ella, a girl of about 6 with a smile that could light up a whole room. But his expression softened as he explained that Ella had a heart condition, something she'd had since birth. He showed me a picture of her, a tiny girl with wide eyes and a mischievous smile, and I felt my heart ache for him, for her. He told me about how his wife had passed away 2 years ago, how he'd taken on the role of both mom and dad to Ella, juggling work, school drop-offs, and the inevitable doctor's appointments. He spoke about his late wife with such kindness, and I could tell that he'd loved her deeply, but he also seemed to carry an invisible weight. He admitted, almost sheepishly, that while he had loved her, he'd never truly felt like he had a partner. They had married young, and somewhere along the way, they'd lost each other. I could see a glimmer of understanding in his eyes, a look that told me he knew the loss of love, the feeling of being alone in a relationship. As we spent more time together, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic or forced. It was quiet, gentle. We began to share more than just project updates. We shared pieces of ourselves, our pasts, our fears. He would tell me about Ella's latest antics, her insistence on learning to ride a bike despite her health issues, her love of animals, and how she begged him to let her adopt a stray kitten. And I would listen, captivated, feeling myself growing more and more attached not just to him, but to this little girl I'd never met. He'd ask about my life, my plans, and even though it was still raw, I'd tell him bits and pieces about Vincent, about what had happened, and how I was trying to rebuild. Michael didn't pity me. He just listened, nodding, his face soft with understanding. One afternoon, he invited me out to see the property. I remember standing by the edge of the river, taking in the stillness of the water as he talked me through his vision for the house. He spoke about it as a home for him and Ella, a fresh start, a place for them to heal and grow. I felt a pang of envy at the idea of starting over so cleanly, with such hope. And then, as he turned to look at me, he grew quiet. The way he looked at me held a warmth I hadn't felt in years, a warmth that made me feel like I mattered, like I was something worth waiting for. It was gentle, subtle, but it was there, a spark that quietly, slowly, began to grow between us. Over time, the line between work and friendship blurred. He would stop by my office just to say hello, and we'd chat about everything from the best spots in town to get coffee to our favorite childhood memories. It felt natural, as if he'd been a part of my life for far longer than just a few months. He joked that he hoped I'd be there to help them move into the house once it was built, and I'd laugh, though the thought left a flutter in my chest. One evening, after a particularly long day, he asked if I'd join him for coffee. We sat in a quiet corner of a cafe, sharing stories, laughing over little things. He listened as I talked about my new apartment, about how I'd slowly started, decorating it, piece by piece. And as we spoke, I realized how safe I felt with him, how easy it was to be myself. There was no judgment, no hidden agendas, just two people finding comfort in each other's company. And slowly, without even realizing it, something in me softened. I hadn't expected to feel anything for anyone so soon, and yet there it was, something real, something new, something I couldn't quite name. As the weeks passed, Michael and Ella became like anchors, grounding me, giving me hope that maybe, just maybe, I could open my heart again. And in that quiet, gentle way, I felt the edges of my old life fading, making room for the possibility of something beautiful ahead. One weekend, Michael invited me over to his place for a quiet evening, pizza and a movie night, he called it. It was simple, laid back, and yet it felt like so much more. I'd spent countless nights alone with Netflix and takeout, but this felt different. It felt like coming home. Michael greeted me at the door with a warm smile, his hair slightly mussed and an apron around his waist. Ella, his 6-year-old, ran up to me with this big, bright grin, already in her pajamas. She'd been hearing about me from her dad for weeks, and I could tell she was eager to have me all to herself for the evening. Her little hand slipped into mine, and she pulled me into their cozy living room, where the air smelled of fresh pizza and laughter lingered from a day of family games. Dinner was casual, but I hadn't laughed so much in ages. Between bites of pepperoni pizza, Ella recounted the story of her adventures with her dolls, a saga so elaborate that it rivaled a Hollywood blockbuster. She sat beside me, her tiny head resting on my shoulder, interrupting her story every now and then to offer me her favorite toppings or to ask what I thought her dolls should do next. The warmth of her little body leaning against mine filled me with an unexpected tenderness. As the night went on, we dimmed the lights, set up blankets on the couch, and put on Ella's favorite animated movie. Halfway through, I felt Ella's small hand reach for mine. She tugged at my fingers, her eyes already half closed as she drifted to sleep, snuggled into my side. I glanced over at Michael, who sat on the other side of the couch, watching us both with an expression that made my heart flutter. Our eyes met, and in that one look, so much was said, things neither of us needed to speak aloud. In that moment, there was an unspoken understanding between us. Here was this man, this wonderful man who had opened his life to me, who trusted me enough to share his world and his little girl. And I felt a warmth spreading through me, a kind of love that was gentle, steady, and patient, a love I'd once thought lost to me. As the movie ended, Michael carefully lifted Ella, carrying her to bed while she clung to his shoulder, half awake and murmuring something sweet to him. When he returned, we lingered in the living room, talking softly so as not to wake her. He shared stories about his wife, about the struggles of raising Ella on his own, and he admitted that he hadn't expected to feel this way again, that he'd given up hope of finding someone who would care about both him and Ella. My heart swelled, and for the first time in years, I felt that I could truly open myself to someone. I let myself imagine a future, one where we could be a family, where laughter and warmth would fill the quiet spaces that used to feel empty. But just as I was beginning to let go of the past, to embrace this new life with Michael, my past came barging back in, quite literally, in the form of Vincent, standing at my doorstep. I remember the day so clearly. I had been lost in my own world, maybe humming a tune that Ella and I had laughed over. I opened the door, expecting the delivery I'd ordered. But there he was, Vincent, standing there, looking more worn down than I'd ever seen him. There was a shadow under his eyes and a heaviness in his face that I hardly recognized. He looked like a shell of the man I'd once loved. His new relationship had crumbled, leaving him adrift and broken. And now, he was here, asking me to take him back. "Clara, I was wrong," he said, his voice rough, full of the regret that was too little, too late. I realized now what I had. I didn't see it before, but I can't believe what I've lost. Can't we try again? The words hurt, even then. For a moment, I felt everything again. The betrayal, the heartache, the years of giving and waiting, the dreams I had clung to for so long. But now, something was different. I didn't feel weak or torn. I didn't feel small in his presence anymore. The anger, the sadness, it wasn't as sharp. I felt them, yes, but they didn't control me. I stood there, looking into his eyes, and saw a man who was as lost as I had once been. But I didn't pity him. I just understood. I realized in that moment that while he'd hurt me deeply, I didn't need anything from him anymore. Not his apology, not his regret. I'd finally reached a place where I was at peace, and no words from him could change that. So I looked at him, calm and steady, and said, "Vincent, I've moved on. I'm finally happy. You made your choice, and now I've made mine. There's nothing left here for us." And with that, I closed the door. As I locked it, I felt a weight lift off me, one I hadn't even known I was still carrying. I was finally free of him, of the pain and disappointment he'd left behind. He had been a chapter in my life, but I was ready to keep turning the pages, to see where this new life would take me. And so, I let myself fall completely into the world I was building with Michael and Ella. Our days were filled with small joys: picnics by the river, afternoons spent baking cookies and laughing as Ella made a mess in the kitchen, quiet evenings on the porch with Michael as we watched the stars and talked about everything and nothing. I watched as Ella's health improved, as her cheeks grew rosy, her laughter filling every room of their little house. With Michael, I had found a love that was tender and true, a love that was built on respect and understanding. I realized then that I'd found a new family, not one born out of tradition or expectation, but one that grew from shared hearts and honest love. Michael and Ella weren't just filling the emptiness Vincent had left. They were creating something new, something beautiful. And I knew, deep in my soul, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. A year later, I stood by the riverbank, feeling the gentle breeze against my skin, surrounded by the laughter and warmth of my newfound family. Karen, with her vibrant energy, was playfully teasing Eric, who, despite his serious demeanor, couldn't help but crack a smile at her antics. Ella, with her infectious laughter, was dancing barefoot along the water's edge, her hair flowing in the wind like a golden banner of joy. And beside me, Michael, my new husband, radiated love and support, his hand resting comfortably on my back, a silent promise of companionship and understanding. As I gazed across the water, my heart swelled with pride and gratitude for the life we had built together. The sun cast a golden hue over our home, its walls filled with memories of laughter, late-night talks, and dreams we shared. Each brick and beam echoed the resilience I discovered within myself, a testament that my life had transformed into something beautiful, despite the shadows of the past. I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp scent of the river mixed with the blooming wildflowers nearby. It was a stark contrast to the suffocating grief that had once engulfed me. I felt whole, not just in my body, but in my spirit, reclaiming the pieces of myself that had felt lost in the aftermath of betrayal. Standing there, I understood that my story didn't conclude with the heartache. Rather, it had evolved into a narrative of healing, love, and new beginnings. In that moment of clarity, I realized that the path I had walked was not merely about overcoming pain, but about embracing every twist and turn, allowing them to guide me toward a brighter future. I had learned to trust again, not just in others, but in myself. The journey had carved a deeper understanding of what love truly meant. It was not just the fairy tale, but the real, raw connections we formed with those who cherished us for who we were. As laughter echoed around me, I felt a wave of warmth wash over my heart. I turned to Michael, who caught my gaze and smiled knowingly. I knew he understood the depth of my journey, the scars I carried, and the strength I had unearthed. Together, we had built a foundation rooted in honesty, respect, and unwavering support. Looking back at the shimmering water, I reflected on how far I'd come, and I couldn't help but smile. My past was no longer a chain that held me back. It was a chapter that had led me to this extraordinary moment. My story was alive and flourishing, and I was ready to write the next exciting pages, filled with love, adventure, and the promise of a beautiful tomorrow.